dari Komplek Balai Budaya Minomartani Ngaglik Sleman. Inilah Radio BBM, jaringan radio komunitas Yogyakarta.
Radio Komunitas Balai Budaya Minomartani. Radio Budaya, Radio Warga, Radio Kita Bersama. Radio Komunitas.
Selamat malam warga budaya and Eid Mubarak to the ones celebrating. In Turkish we call Eid Bayram, and so in Turkish we would say Bayramınız Mubarak also. You're listening to Global Chain, where we come together each Wednesday to talk about my cultural experiences and encounters outside of Indonesia. As you might or might not already know, I am born and raised in Denmark, and I have Turkish roots from both my parents. And to give you a bit of context, my grandparents from my mom's side migrated from Turkey to Denmark back in the 70s. And after that, more family members joined the journey. So since then, we've become a bigger and bigger family in Denmark. And just to use a bit sort of society's box terms, so to say, this makes my mom a second generation and me a third generation immigrant. Again, just to give you some context to what's about to come. Growing up, and especially in my teens, I struggled to make sense of to what extent am I Danish, to what extent am I Turkish. And the older I get and the more I travel, the more I meet new people, the better I understand that so many people are struggling to find this balance between cultures for one reason or another. And don't get me wrong, I truly wouldn't have had it any other way. I think I've gained so much from both cultures, from all cultures that I've become part of. But it is challenging. It can definitely be challenging. So I think it deserves some attention. In today's program, we talk about how culture has played a role in our upbringing and how culture continues to play a role in the way we raise our children. A quick disclaimer, I don't have any children, so I will be mindful of not giving a big statement on what I would do. I think that's always really important to be careful with that. And for my family listening, this is also not a hint of me being pregnant, so that one closed as well. For this program, I have spoken with 3 of my cousins about this topic, and they have all given each of their individual input. And I'm so super grateful for their input. I know that my cousins, not just these 3 that have answered, but all of my cousins are super busy hustling between obviously working, managing family lives, all the other socials, and also preparing for the holiday, preparing for Eid, for Bayram. So I'm super grateful for their responses. And funny thing, while we talk about culture, so I say cousins. I say 3 of my cousins have given their input. When I say cousin, I mean it in the broadest sense possible, which is super Turkish to me, and that's why I find it funny to mention it right away. One of them is my male cousin's wife. So my male cousin's wife is one of the women that I call cousins here. They married, I believe, 4 years ago, I think, 4 years ago. And since then, she's just become an integrated part of our cousin group. She is in the group chats. She's totally counted in. And for me, in my experience, that is something that is rather Turkish. So I just wanted to mention that. I find it really beautiful. The other one of the ones that I'm calling my cousin is my mom's second cousin. So we're not even the same generation or family generation. She's my mom's second cousin. And only one of them is my first cousin, meaning my uncle's daughter. So I have one cousin-in-law, one mom's second cousin, one first cousin in this program. And in my daily life, they are my cousins. So just a funny one before we start. For this program, I have asked my cousins 8 questions. And that's also how we'll structure the program. We'll go through those 8 questions, and then I'll explain the answers from my cousins, obviously being aware that they go through me. So it might have some of my interpretation, but I hope to represent their answers in the best way. Also, my cousins have answered in Danish, and I will obviously be explaining and translating them to English. So there might also be some meaning lost there, but I hope obviously to bring it forward in the most true way as possible. The first question I ask my cousins is, how does culture play a role in the way you were raised? And I'll try to sort of sum up the answers, and I won't go through them one by one, saying like cousin 1, cousin 2, cousin 3, but I'll try to sum up some of the patterns, and obviously also sometimes they don't totally agree, and that's fine. What is an occurring pattern is a sense of restriction, so that culture played a role of restricting, and that means both in terms of going out, staying out till late, but also going out in terms of clubbing or staying over at a friend's house. That culture played in a role of restricting that, both because they are Turkish, but also because they are women, or back then that they were girls. So there is this sense of culture being a restriction, and being more restricted than their male peers, or brothers, cousins, and also more restricted than their Danish peers. And I totally recognize and resonate with this. I think my cousins and I will have different degrees of restriction, and that's all normal. But I do definitely recognize the culture playing a role, a restricting role. Something else that comes up, a reoccurring pattern, is respect, and in different ways. So both and respect in a way that feels restricting. So respecting the elderly in a way that you sit in a very specific way when you're around them, or when they are men in the room, that you again restrict the way that you sit around them, the way that you talk, the way you behave, but also respect in bit more of a positive light, in the sense of respecting the elderly and being there for them, being polite, thanking for food when someone has cooked, thank you for thanking people for traveling to you, for coming to you. And in Turkish, we would say eline sağlık when someone has cooked for you, which is an appreciation of their health, but their hands' health, actually, eline sağlık. And ayağına sağlık, you say when someone has come to you or traveled to you, and that is an appreciation of their health in their feet. It sounds very strange when you translate it, but it's I think that is the closest that comes to it. If someone listens and has a better translation, please do share. Something that also comes up is the language. So one of my cousins say, well, we would always speak Turkish at home. We would watch Turkish TV, and that for her is how she would see culture in the household, and it's important for her to also give that to her kids, that they're able to speak Turkish. And also a sense of family, so a sense of being there for your family, of prioritizing your family, of helping your family. One of my cousins say that is probably one of the strongest things she has been taught through culture, is to be available for her family. And then lastly, something very recurring as well that I also recognize totally is that when we talk about being raised, so when we talk about our childhood, we very often refer back to our moms and not our dads. So we're definitely raised mostly by our mothers, and that is something that is a recurring theme. And it's interesting because I realized it very late. I think it's so, I wouldn't say obvious to me maybe, but it's just so ingrained in me that my mom has raised me, and I know that from my family, from my cousins, their moms have raised them. Our dads weren't around much, they were busy working, and I think again it's a cultural thing that raising the children is on the woman. So that's an interesting thing, and we'll talk about that a bit later as well, when we talk about what is different in the way we are raised versus how my cousins are now raising their children. The second question I ask my cousins is, how does culture play a role in the way you raised your children? And important to say, my cousins, all three cousins, they do have children. So that's maybe an important fact. As I said, I do not have it, so I also won't pretend that I do. Again, I won't be going through them cousin by cousin. I'll sort of just discuss the answers together, and I will make a differentiation if I think it's important to say that these answers comes from two different people. What's really interesting about culture is that culture is so often linked with religion, and it's no different here. My cousins definitely also mention religion as they discuss culture, and so often culture and religion are mixed, and so often one does not go without another, and sometimes we even cannot differentiate between them, and that's also something we'll be talking about. So one of my cousins, she says that the way that she integrates culture into the way that she raises her children is by teaching them about our religious holidays. So for example, Eid or Eid, or Bayram, whatever you might call it, and Arefe. And it's important for her that her kids, she has one child, one boy of 2 years old, very cute. It's really important to her that he understands some of the religious aspects. And she says, well, in terms of the Danish culture, they live in Denmark, that will already be integrated through kindergarten, through school, through his environment. So it's important to her to give him some of the Turkish culture, or at least the religion, that he can bring that with him, and she hopes that he'll bring that as well in the way that he raises his children one day. Something else that's interesting is that one of my cousins, she says, well, culture doesn't play a huge part in the way that I raise my children. And she says for her it's more important that she aligns with her husband on their common values, their common goals, and that they are really good at communicating with their children. And she wants that her children can come to her for everything. And she says that is in sort of opposition to a very strict culture or a strict way of raising your children. Because she says she doesn't want them to fear that they'll meet sort of cultural backlash or cultural resistance. She wants that they can come to her for everything. So I find that really interesting. I'm not saying that my cousins put Turkish culture on one side and open communication on another side, but I do recognize a bit this way of thinking or this pattern of thinking. And what it reminds me of is that my mom actually had a very open communication flow, at least from what I've experienced. And I have heard a couple of times that my mom raised us very Danish. It's interesting to me now to read this, or to get this response from one of my cousins. Because it takes me back to some of those comments of my mom raising us very Danish. And I am not sure if that's 100% based on the open communication, maybe it's based on something else. But it just reminded me of that, sort of putting Turkish culture not together with open communication. So yeah, interesting. Very interesting. The third question I ask my cousins is, what have you either actively or subconsciously taken with you from how you were raised onto how you raised your children? A long question. I hope you're following. One of my cousins says that for her, it's the way that she cleans. It's the way that she wants the house to be clean at all times in case someone steps by. And I so resonate with this. And I find it hilarious because I do exactly the same thing. My mom is also a complete clean freak. And that is something I've experienced. It's very cultural. And it's also something that I never intended to take with me, but that I definitely do. So I find this so funny. And my cousin was even saying, oh, this might be such a silly response. But it is really true. And it impacts the way that she raises her child subconsciously and unwantingly, because she would then be a bit too over him, tidying him up, making sure that he wouldn't make a mess. And she said, well, he should make a mess. He's 2 years old, poor boy. But it happens from time to time, and she was a bit laughing about it and saying, well, I try to be mindful of it. It doesn't happen too often, but it is so interesting how these things sort of pop up without you even wanting it. Something else that comes up is teaching your children Turkish, and also teaching them the holiday. So again, Bayram comes up as an important factor. And saying eline sağlık, which means, thank you for cooking, or thank you for food. Ayağınıza sağlık, and those type of things. So thank you for coming. And then one of my cousins is saying something that is so funny, that she says, well, subconsciously, I totally teach my children the same double standard as I have been told as a Muslim at home, which is that she's been brought up in a home where it was okay to drink alcohol, but it totally wasn't okay to eat pork. And that's also something I resonate with. I come from quite a similar household. And she says, well, that's obviously not something you actively teach your children, but it's what they will see and what they will learn. So yeah, she's a bit laughing. She was a bit laughing of herself for this one, but that's how it goes. That's how she was raised, and she said that's probably how my children will be raised as well. And then what comes up is the restriction of letting your children sleep out. And one of my cousins, she has a teenage girl, and she says, well, when my mom told me I couldn't sleep out with friends, I totally didn't understand her. It was really strange to me. There was no logic in it. But she says, well, now that I have a teenage daughter, I do resonate with that. And I also don't feel comfortable with her sleeping out. So that's an interesting also realization of something you just totally couldn't imagine making sense when you were a teenager yourself. And now when you're raising a teenage daughter, she says, well, to her, that is not something she's comfortable with. The fourth question I asked my cousins is, how is the way they raise their children different from how they were raised? And to this, my cousins actually share three very different opinions, or they give me three different input. And I'll therefore go through them sort of one by one, saying first cousin, second cousin, third cousin, not specifying who is who. It totally doesn't matter in this discussion. So one of my cousins, she says, well, for her, it's the way of showing love. And I found her answer extremely honest. So I hope to respect it in the best way possible. She says, well, I didn't receive love actively. My parents didn't hug me. My parents didn't tell me that they love me. She says, well, I knew that they loved me, but they weren't showing it actively. It was very different. She mentioned that her mom would get very angry over small things, and in her opinion, rather weird things. And she didn't experience the same level of patience as what she's giving to her son. So she says what she very actively does differently is to dance with her kid, play with him, really actively love him, hug him, kiss him, tell him over and over again that she loves him. And also, as I said, having patience, explaining things over and over again, and not losing patience, not getting angry. And then she mentioned something else that I find extremely beautiful and important to mention, is that she says, well, in our culture, it's so often about other people. What will other people think? What will other people say? But also, how do I please other people in the best way? And she says for her, a very active decision is to make sure that her son feels and knows that he is first, and then everyone else comes second. And I think that's so beautiful. I'll note that down in my own How to Raise My Children book, because I just find that, beautiful. I cannot find another word for it. I just, I resonate with it. I totally agree with it. And then another one of my cousins, she says, well, she actually takes a lot of the values from her family, but again, understanding culture very broadly. For her, culture is solving conflicts together, is talking together, having conversations together. And then she mentions car holidays, which I just find great. I just find it great because I just so resonate with it. We've had so many car holidays, and to give a bit of context, we would always, as kids, drive from Denmark to Turkey every single summer. And back then, there was no air conditioning, so it was a warm trip, but it was just like such a big part of that holiday was the car trip. So when she says car holiday, that is that driving around, the whole family in the car, all the luggage in the car, and just it was such a hot mess and so much fun at the same time. And I'm really curious next time I meet with my cousin to really dive into the whole car holiday experience, because that was really something else. And she says, well, for her, that's part of the culture, and she really wants to give that to her children as well. And then she says something which I find so important. We've talked a bit about this already, but here it really comes out very clear. She says, well, the main difference in the way that I raise my children from the way that I have been raised is that I share this raising experience with my husband 50-50. We raise our children together 50-50, and that was very different. In her upbringing, she very openly says, well, I was raised by my mom. So that's definitely also a massive difference. And then last but not least, one of my cousins, she says, well, for her it's really important. We've talked a bit about this before, but she says, well, it's really important for her to educate her children on the difference between culture and religion, and that is to be able to take with it, to take with you from culture what you like, but knowing that is different from religion. I'm not explaining this very well, but it's sort of to say, she explains that you need to be able to differentiate between culture and religion so that you know what you take with you and what you leave behind. And next to that, she says, well, for her, that the way she raises her children, or the way that she aims to raise her children, is to minimize the difference between boys and girls. And she's not claiming that she is 100% raising them the same. I'm not sure that is the goal either. But she does say that in terms of opportunities given, in terms of restriction, if it would be up to her alone, she would want to minimize those differences between boys and girls. The fifth question I ask my cousins is, what surprises you in the way you raised your children? Is there anything you care for that you thought you wouldn't care for? And the other way around, are there things that you don't care for that you thought you would care for? Again, long question. I hope you're still following. I'm summing these answers into two categories. One of them is being a lot more patient than expected. So one of my cousins, she says, well, I'm not a patient person. I can quite snap at other things, but I'm very patient with my son. And she says, I'm really enjoying that, to have the patience for him, having the patience for him to do his own thing, as long as he's not in danger, as long as he doesn't put obviously anyone else in danger. She says that is really giving her a lot of energy. And then something else is one of my cousins, she says, well, she's a lot more in dilemmas about culture, about religion than she expected. And she says that what comes up is this dilemma of, to what extent do I personally care about this? So to what extent am I doing this? Am I raising my children in this way because I believe in it, because it corresponds with my values? Or to what extent am I doing it for others? So for culture, for other people to say you're doing it correctly. So yeah, I find that very interesting as well. And I can only imagine that you go through that when you raise your children. I also go through that with myself. To what extent am I doing certain things to please the culture, to please my environment, and to what extent am I doing something because I truly believe in it? So I definitely believe more people can resonate with this. The sixth question I ask my cousins is, have you experienced any disalignments or disagreements with your husband in the way that you want to raise your children? And the answers quite vary from, and we never disagree, up until we disagree a lot. So there's quite some things in the spectrum, and obviously, as I said, I don't have kids yet, and I have no clue where we're going to be in the spectrum. Obviously, you hope to not disagree, but I think that is so normal and so common, and it will definitely happen. I'm sure of it. So one of my cousins, she says, well, we actually don't disagree a whole lot. We're quite in alignment on what we want, our values, and we just, when things come up, we discuss sort of pros and cons, and then we feel what feels right, basically. In the middle is another one of my cousins saying, well, I don't think we disagree on the cultural aspects or the religious aspects, but we might disagree on and then she comes with a very specific example that I absolutely love. She says, well, we disagree on how much the phone should be present in the household. And she says, well, my husband has his phone up quite a lot. And that's something she quite disagrees with. And she says, well, that impacts also the way we raise our children, or our child. They have one child. And interestingly, maybe this is also maybe a cultural thing. And I'm not saying cultural as in national culture, but culture can be so much broader than that. It can even be a generational thing. It can also be a gender thing. It can be so many other things. So maybe it can still be linked to culture, but at least my cousin says, well, she doesn't feel that it's cultural, that it's related to culture or religion, but that other things come up. And then on the other side of the spectrum, so the spectrum that goes, well, we disagree quite a lot and it's difficult to solve, which is also such an honest answer. I can really imagine that if you disagree, and because raising your children is just such an important part of your life, and you obviously want to raise your children in a way that it corresponds with your values. So just, I really want to respect that. I can imagine that it's difficult. And she says, well, we disagree mostly on to what extent tradition and culture should play a role in our lives. And she quite picks that apart from religion, as she has done also previously in the answers, by saying it's not that I want to minimize the religious education we give our children, but I don't agree with restricting them based on tradition and culture, because she finds that culture has less ground than religion, at least for her. The seventh question that I ask my cousins is, what do you wish your children would understand or hope they understand one day? And I've categorized the answers into two topics, so to say. So one of them is, well, I really hope that my children will understand our culture and pass our culture on to their children, and in that way maintain our culture. And the other one, the other category is, well, I hope that my children will understand that culture is human-made. Because it's human-made, you have to be critical towards it, and you have to make important decisions based on your own logic and not follow culture blindly. So on one side, I hope you will maintain culture, our culture. I hope you'll pass it on to your children. And on the other side, I hope you'll be critical towards the culture, and make up your own mind. And initially, I put them on these two different categories. Initially, I saw them as two different ways of looking at culture. But then I thought a bit more about it, and I realized, well, aren't we all picking bits and pieces of the culture and then passing that on? I guess our parents have also either actively or subconsciously picked bits and pieces of the culture and passed that on. So maybe they're not very different. And that made me think about things I have kept with me. So to give a bit of context to the ones not knowing, I haven't lived in Denmark for the past 5 years. I live in the Netherlands with my husband. He's Dutch. So I haven't been in this sort of Turkish community or environment that I would usually be for 5 years. And what's interesting is that I've definitely as well, both actively and subconsciously, picked from the culture. The last question I ask my cousins is, what have you learned about yourself through your children? And to this, one of my cousins, she says, well, I actually didn't feel like a grown-up before I had children, so before I became a mother. And I just immediately had to laugh when I heard that, because I so often think, well, I cannot become a mother because I'm not old enough, I'm not grown up enough. And then for her to say, well, I actually also didn't feel like a grown-up till I became a mother, just, I guess that's the trick. And then she also says, well, I really learned to love more deeply. And she says, I learned to love unconditionally and also without expectations. And I just find that super beautiful to say, because I have definitely, I can confirm or I can say that I've definitely felt unconditionally loved by my parents. I've also had expectations, but I don't always think expectations are bad. But what I do think is that when expectations and the ability to be loved are combined, then I think it's dangerous, and then I think it's toxic. So if you're only allowed to be loved if you meet certain expectations, then it's not unconditional. So I find it so beautiful. What she says here is that love that she gives her child is unconditional, it's without expectation. And then she sums up by saying that she has learned to live for herself, for her child, for her unit. In Dutch they call it the gezin. Gezin is really parents and children, and so she has learned to live for them and not for others. And that's also what we spoke about earlier, right? That to some extent, or in my cousin's experience and in my experience as well, Turkish culture can be rather linked to pleasing everyone else but your gezin. So everyone else, then the core family. And she says, well, that's definitely something that she has learned or is still learning, to prioritize her unit. And then something else, one of my other cousins, she says, well, for her, what she continuously learn with her children is about her own values, because in raising her children, she constantly has to reevaluate her values and what she wants to pass on, what part of the culture she wants to pass on, what religious aspects she wants to pass on. And so in raising her children, she's constantly facing these internal battles of finding her own values. So yeah. With the final question being covered, I want to close off today's program. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's obviously a sensitive topic, discussing raising your children, discussing culture, discussing religion, and I truly hope I haven't offended anyone with this program. I'm very curious to hear if culture plays a different role for the way that you raise your children, for the way that you have been raised by your parents. Always very curious to hear from you. And with that, I just want to say terima kasih warga budaya for listening and for being curious. I hope you've enjoyed today's program. I have definitely enjoyed it myself. I think what I take from it is that obviously I've known my cousins my whole life. And there are so many things there's so many elements, there's so many statements from what they've said that I didn't know about them. And this really encourages me to have deeper conversations. It really encourages me to ask more questions, to be curious, and to listen. God knows I talk a lot and I enjoy to talk. But I think really, really great things comes from listening. So that's what I take with it. Have a great night, warga budaya, dan sampai jumpa di siaran berikutnya. Bye-bye.
Dari Komplek Balai Budaya Minomartani, Ngaglik, Sleman. Inilah Radio BBM. Jaringan Radio Komunitas Yogyakarta.
Dipancarkan dari kawasan Balai Budaya Minomartani, Radio Komunitas BBM FM.